Hey guys, tonight we are going to delve deep into the haunting final hours of a celebrated king. Let's start with a spine-chilling truth recorded in historical documents. Court records reveal a grim reality. The servants of King Henry VIII frequently heard him pleading, crying, and whispering the names of those he had sent to their deaths, especially his wives and his dearest friends. He spoke to invisible spectres, begging forgiveness from souls who had passed away years ago. This is no mere legend. It is historical proof of a king who made himself a prisoner of his own conscience. You are about to witness the moment history strikes back, and why Henry's death was darker, stranger, and more haunting than any fictional horror story. Imagine this. A man who once shook the whole of Europe and single-handedly rewrote religious law is now confined to his deathbed, screaming in unbearable loneliness. His room is shrouded in darkness, but what haunts him is not a ghost from another world. It is something far more devastating, his very own crimes and guilt gnawing at his soul from within. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are and what the local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Henry VIII, once the sovereign whose edicts reshaped Christendom and whose court glittered with pageantry, drew his final breath on a cold morning of January 28, 1547, shut away from all but his closest attendants. In those last days, he lay in a bed of heavy velvet beneath the arches of Whitehall Palace, his body ravaged by a festering sore upon his left leg that refused to heal, oozing a stench so foul that even seasoned guards recoiled. Each night, as the castle corridors fell silent, he would thrash and toss beneath the blankets, his massive frame by then swollen and deformed gasping for relief. And in the dark hush, the echoes of his own guilt took shape as whispers at the foot of his bed. He had once strode across his realm like a titan of flesh and blood. At the age of 18, having ascended the throne on April 21st, 1509, he stood 6'2" in height, an imposing figure for any era. Venetian envoys described him as the most handsome potentate I ever set eyes upon, marvelling at his broad shoulders and confident gait. He hunted stag in the royal forests by day, his warhorse paddling through dew-drenched glades. By night he danced at interminable balls, the torchlight catching the gold embroidery of his doublet. That same Henry composed verses and hymns whose melodies still haunt the vaults of Westminster Abbey. For 20 years he reigned as both warrior and poet king, his laughter echoing beneath hammerbeam roofs and along banquet hall tables. But power and splendour offered no immunity against the spectre of conscience. In the shadowed corners of his private chambers, he began to see figures no servant could perceive. The first apparition took the form of Catherine, his wife of 24 years, exiled to a damp castle at Kimbolton, her voice carried upon a chill breeze through darkened hallways. Then appeared Anne, the queen who had promised him heirs, and instead delivered heartbreak, her ghostly eyes hollow with sorrow. One night, Thomas More's face materialized, his noble presence standing beneath a tapestry that depicted the Last Judgment. The king would rise from his satin sheets, robe trailing behind, and speak into the emptiness, pleading for pardon, weeping for mercy, as though each word might appease some unseen tribunal. Court records, preserved in card catalogue volumes, note that servants on watch duty heard Henry's murmured confessions to phantoms of his own creation. They heard him whisper the names of wives he had condemned, Catherine, Anne, Catherine, and even catch his trembling voice entreating forgiveness from friends he had beheaded. "Thomas, have mercy upon my soul," he would gasp, as though expecting an answer. Guards stationed beyond the tabernacle doors would exchange haunted glances, reluctant to admit that their king conversed with shadows. Once, he had boldly declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, ripping his realm away from papal authority in Rome. That same resolve melted under the weight of remorse. By candlelight, he would stare at the great oak crucifix above his bed, his reflection fractured in the polished silver of a nearby ewer, struggling to reconcile the man who commanded legions with the man who trembled before memories of his own wrath. Guilt, he learned, is a greater tyrant than any mortal he had vanquished. In those final hours, the stately hallways of Whitehall grew deathly still. The trumpets that once announced his sovereign presence remained silent. Even the palace dogs seemed to sense the stirring of something more than mortal. Their howls faded at dusk, and they kept their distance from his chamber door. He, the once mighty Henry VIII, lay bound by chains of penitence, awaiting the final summons he could no longer outrun. And so, as dawn's pale light seeped through narrow windows on that January morning, the last of Henry's laboured breaths slipped away. His great frame stilled, the horrors of his mind at last falling silent. The throne stood empty, and with it, a kingdom left to reckon with the legacy of its fallen monarch, an emperor undone. Not by rival armies or deadly illness alone, but by the ghosts of his own making. In the beginning, the realm of England under Henry VIII brimmed with promise and splendour. On the 21st of April in the year 1509, the 18-year-old prince ascended the throne, his countenance radiant with youthful ambition. He spoke of glory in distant wars, of dance and feast, and of music that would sway the hearts of all who heard it. By day, he pursued the hunt with tireless vigour, his courtiers trailing through verdant forests, spears poised to bring down the stag. By night, torchlight danced upon tapestries as he led courtly revels, the lilt of his own compositions drifting through the vaulted halls of Westminster Abbey. His laughter was said to ring like bells, clear and untroubled. Beside him stood Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, whose presence was far more than ornamental. Born a Spanish infanta, she carried herself with grace and unyielding strength. When Henry departed for campaigns in France, it was Catherine who sat in council, her voice steady as she guided ministers through affairs of state. In the spring of 1501, she bore him a daughter, Mary, the monarch's cherished progeny. So deep was his affection that he styled Catherine Mi Corazon, meaning my heart, in public ceremonies and private letters alike. Their union, celebrated by chroniclers as a living fairy tale, seemed destined to bind two nations and herald an era of peace. Yet beneath the gilded surface lay a far darker yearning. From his earliest days on the throne, Henry harboured a singular obsession, the birth of a male heir to secure the Tudor succession. By the year 1527, Catherine had reached the age of 42, and prospects for another child dimmed. Henry interpreted this barrenness not as nature's decree, but as divine reproach for marrying his brother's widow. He sought an annulment from the Holy Father in Rome, but Pope Clement VII refused to dissolve the sacred bond. Even Thomas More, the king's most trusted confidant, implored him to preserve the church's unity and spare his queen the disgrace of repudiation. Henry's resolve did not waver. Love had long since given way to an inexorable drive for authority and posterity. With a heavy hand he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, severing ties with the papacy in Rome. Monasteries that had stood for 8 centuries were suppressed, their lands and treasures confiscated and sold to fund royal coffers. The ancient stones of abbeys were broken, their altars dismantled, and the alms they once distributed to the poor vanished overnight. Cathedral bells fell silent, replaced by the clatter of hammers dismantling cloisters. As the kingdom basked in this new dawn of ecclesiastical independence, Henry's own dreams turned to ashes. The euphoria of conquest faded, leaving behind a stark reality, the pursuit of power at the cost of faith and mercy. Courtiers who once toasted to the king's name now whispered in shadowed corridors, uneasy at the swift transformation of holy institutions into vessels of state revenue. The gentle hum of daily worship gave way to the harsh clang of expropriation. From these upheavals emerged a saga of tragic consequence. Catherine, once crowned with honour, found herself cast aside in the quest for a son. The love that had blossomed in youthful devotion wilted under the strain of royal edict. In the silent chambers of Kimbolton Castle, she spent her final years writing letters of lamentation, her ink stained with tears for a marriage shattered by ambition. Yet Henry pressed onward, undeterred, as though convinced that each act of defiance against Rome would inch him closer to the heir he so desperately craved. Thus the kingdom's fairy tale era unravelled into a tapestry of blood and regret. Henry's great revolt against papal authority ushered in a reign marked not by unity, but by division between old faith and new law, between sovereign and subject, and ultimately between king and queen. As dusk fell on this chapter of Tudor history, the bright promise of youth had curdled into a grim portent of nights haunted not by ghosts of supernatural origin, but by the very conscience of a man who broke kingdoms in pursuit of a legacy that slipped ever farther from his grasp. Anne Boleyn appeared in Henry's life like a radiant but perilous morning star, dazzling all who beheld her, yet carrying within her the promise of a storm. Unlike the caricature of a courtly mistress that posterity would later paint, she was an erudite woman, schooled in French, Latin, and the arts of diplomacy, determined never to repeat the fate of her sister Mary, who had been discarded like yesterday's cloak. Anne demanded not the scraps of affection but the full measure of royal standing. A public betrothal, the crown of queen, and all the privileges that accompanied it. For the first time in his life, Henry VIII encountered a pursuit that required his patience. He, the monarch accustomed to instantaneous obedience, found his heart quickening at each delayed reply from Anne. In letters penned with trembling hand, he entreated her, "Pray let me know the full measure of your mind concerning our love." The noble words betraying the same youthful ardour often ascribed to boys in their first moments of longing. Thus began a contest of wills more consequential than any joust. Henry chose to upend the ancient union between England and Rome, rather than relinquish his promise to Anne. On the 12th day of February in the year 1531, the King's Privy Council first broached the question of annulment, and by 25 January 1532, Cardinal Wolsey had convened a synod at Blackfriars to consider the case. When Rome balked, refusing to declare his marriage to Catherine void, Henry pressed onward. He proclaimed himself supreme head of the Church of England by statute in 1534, shattering centuries of papal authority. The dissolution of monasteries, begun in earnest in March of 1536, was but the opening gambit in a series of seizures that stripped stone cloisters of their sacred trappings and scattered their revenues to the royal coffers. Yet the human toll proved deeper than the loss of leaded windows and manuscript scrolls. On the 6th of July, 1535, Sir Thomas More, once Chancellor and Henry's most trusted confidant, was executed on Tower Hill for refusing to acknowledge the King's supremacy over the Church. His head fell beneath the blade as the church bells tolled in mournful protest. Just days earlier, on the 22nd of June, 1535, Bishop John Fisher met a similar fate for his steadfast loyalty to Rome. These were not strangers to Henry. They were men who had held his children at christening fonts, counselled him in moments of doubt, and revered him as sovereign. Yet, in the calculus of dynastic necessity, their lives weighed less than the prospect of a male heir. Amidst this upheaval, Anne's ascent was swift and spectacular. On the 28th of May, in the year 1533, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, and a fortnight later, on the 19th of June, she was crowned Queen at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was resplendent. Anne's coronation robe glimmered with pearls and embroidered roses, a testament to her triumph, and to Henry's triumph, in bending the course of English history to his will. Yet even as the crown settled upon her head, shadows gathered at court. The dissolution of the monasteries left thousands destitute, their charities gone, and noble families divided between loyalty to the old church and allegiance to the new king. Henry and Anne's marriage, once a beacon of romantic valour, was soon beset by tragedy. She failed to produce the coveted male heir he so desperately sought. 2 pregnancies ended in miscarriage, one in March of 1534 and another in January of 1536, each loss deepening the court's unease. Henry's own health, weakened by jousting injuries and the festering wound in his leg, gave way to bouts of fever and melancholy. Anne, once the object of his deepest devotion, began to feel the chill of his doubt. In the snare of politics and personal dread, Henry turned upon his queen. Accusations of adultery were levelled in May of 1536, charges that Anne had entangled herself with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. Despite the absence of credible evidence, she was tried and condemned. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold at the Tower of London. In her final address, she raised her eyes heavenward and offered a prayer. "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you," her words as gentle as a night breeze. Then, with one swift stroke, her life was cut short, and the morning star that had once shone so brightly in Henry's sky was extinguished forever. Thus concluded the luminous, perilous chapter of Anne Boleyn, a union born of love's ambition and crowned by political revolution, yet undone by the relentless pursuit of posterity. Under her radiant glow, Henry had shattered church and state. Beneath that same glow, he would find himself haunted by the spectres of his own making. Catherine of Aragon endured a fate as cruel as it was unjust. After 24 years side by side with Henry VIII, the woman he had publicly hailed as "my heart" was stripped of every royal dignity. On the 20th of May, in the year 1533, Parliament passed the Act of Submission, declaring Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void, and she was denounced as a mere widow, no longer queen. By the summer of that same year, she was conveyed to Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire, an ancient fortress of damp stone and draughty corridors, where she was confined to 2 modest rooms, their windows small, and their floors cold beneath a perpetual chill. For 3 long years, Catherine lived in slow desolation. Her frame, once full and regal, wasted away. Her cheeks, once crowned by auburn tresses, grew pale as mist. Each day she awoke to the echo of her own loneliness, stitching by candlelight the name Henry onto tablecloths so many times that her needle hand trembled with sorrow. Servants and gentlewomen assigned to her service often wept in secret chambers, bearing witness to the gradual dimming of her noble spirit. Even the castle's chaplain, whose duty it was to offer comfort through prayer, found his voice choked by grief as he watched her frailty deepen with every rising Sunday. On the 7th of January in the year 1536, Catherine breathed her final sigh. She lay upon a simple pallet, the same 2 rooms that had become her prison, her wedding ring still encircling her finger as though she clung to the memory of vows that once bound 2 hearts. In her last whispered breath, she uttered a single, chilling word: "Cursed." Those who stood beside her described the moment as one of hushed terror, as though her voice carried the weight of an ancient malediction. Barely weeks later, Henry discovered the first signs of vindication, though he could not interpret it as such. One morning in late January of 1536, he awoke to an agonizing twinge in his left leg. What began as a small inflamed blotch soon burst into a ghastly sore, oozing, foul-smelling pus that clung to his linens and dripped onto polished floorboards. Physicians applied poultices of bread and wine, soaked bandages in rosewater and mercury, yet nothing stemmed the infection's relentless advance. It festered, grew, and revolted even the most stoic courtier who dared approach the royal chamber. In his desperation, Henry sought solace in his new wife, Anne Boleyn, who was then expecting their first child. He imagined that the sweetness of impending fatherhood might temper his anguish. Instead, fate dealt another harsh blow. In early January 1536, only days after Catherine's death, Henry suffered a near-fatal accident during a joust before court. His steed, spooked by the thunder of hooves, bolted, hurling the king against the castle gate. He was unconscious for 2 hours, and when he revived, the wound in his left leg, long dormant beneath scar tissue from a youthful tilt-yard injury, had burst open anew. Anne, stricken by her own trials, having already lost 2 pregnancies in the autumn of 1533 and the spring of 1534, felt the crushing weight of expectation once more. As her body bore the promise of new life, the court watched with bated breath. But months later, in March of 1536, that hope was extinguished. Anne miscarried, and the promised heir slipped from her grasp. Henry, weakened by riding accident and plagued by a festering ulcer, felt the world close in on him. The air within Whitehall Palace grew heavy with the scent of infection and the memory of Catherine's final curse. Thus, as winter deepened, Henry found himself ensnared in a web woven from the threads of his own making. A leg wound that defied all cure, a mind haunted by the loss of the woman he once called "my heart," and the cruel irony that his quest for a male heir had birthed only sorrow. In the flicker of candlelight, he would sit alone in the mournful hush, the tremor of age and disease upon him, and ponder the price of the crown he had so ruthlessly defended. The kingdom outside continued its daily rhythms, tax collectors, merchants, and church bells, but within the royal chambers, time itself had grown lethargic, as if the very pulse of England echoed the slow, weary beat of a wounded king's heart. Anne Boleyn, once the brilliant dawn of Henry's second chance at dynastic security, soon revealed herself as the catalyst for yet another chapter of sorrow. By the turn of the year 1536, she had endured 2 miscarriages in the autumn of 1533 and the spring of 1534, and the court watched her with hushed anxiety. When she lost what would have been a male heir in January of 1536, the king's gaze turned once more to something darker than regret. A cold fear reminiscent of his look upon Catherine in her final days. Anne's repeated failures to produce a son, the male offspring, so essential to Tudor hopes, weighed upon Henry like a guillotine waiting to fall. In the aftermath of that third miscarriage, the air within Whitehall Palace grew thick with whisperings. Courtiers exchanged furtive glances as Henry retreated into his private chambers, his face drawn and pale beneath the flickering candlelight. He no longer stood as the robust monarch of 2 decades earlier. Instead, he seemed diminished, haunted by the spectre of his own ambition. And yet fate intervened with chilling precision. In May of 1536, Henry, already hardened by shame and desperation, decreed a purge that would shatter Anne's world. He levelled charges of adultery against her, accusing her of illicit liaisons with no fewer than 5 men, among them her own brother, George Boleyn. These accusations, unfounded and cruel, functioned as a vice upon Anne's throat, leaving her no recourse but submission to royal decree. The trial, held within the Tower of London, unfolded with a grim inevitability. Anne, once lauded for her wit and learning, stood at the bar surrounded by judges loyal to Henry's will. She denied every allegation, her voice trembling but her dignity intact, as she faced the assembled peers. Yet truth mattered little in that sombre chamber. The machinery of state demanded her fall. On the 19th day of May, in the year 1536, Anne ascended the scaffold, her crown exchanged for a dark gown as the morning sun cast long shadows upon the turf. At 28 years old, she laid down her life with a final act of grace. Lifting her eyes heavenward, she prayed, "I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you." Those words, uttered with unwavering kindness, echoed through the hush, a testament to her enduring compassion even in the face of death. By the next day, 20 of May, 1536, Henry moved with breathtaking swiftness. As if discarding the ashes of his shattered second marriage, he betrothed himself to Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting whose gentle demeanour and quiet obedience offered the illusion of solace. The rapid transition from Anne's own promise of queenship to Jane's impending coronation left the court reeling. Here was a monarch who could enact executions with a single signature, yet could not still the voice of conscience that cried out in every darkened hallway. Meanwhile, the physical malady that had plagued Henry for months now asserted itself more viciously than ever. The ulcer on his left leg, which had first erupted in January, refused to heal. It festered beneath scabs of yellowish crust, exuding a fetid discharge that stained bandages and dripped upon chamber floors. Courtiers dared not approach without incensing the air. During audiences, they discreetly burnished censers of sandalwood and frankincense, hoping to mask the odour that clung to Henry's royal person. The king, once renowned for his robust constitution, now suffered interminable agony with each step. His physicians, at their wits' end, applied poultices of bread soaked in ointment and bound the wound with cloths steeped in rosewater, but the foulness only deepened. In the gloom of his private suite, Henry's mood oscillated with alarming volatility. At times, he would chuckle softly, recalling days of courtly revels as if transported back to his youth. In the next breath, he would erupt into fits of rage, admonishing invisible conspirators in a voice raw with suspicion. On certain nights he would awaken shrieking, tears streaking his cheeks, convinced he heard Catherine and Anne weeping beyond the walls. Servants, stationed beyond the king's door, would pause in terror at the sound half prayer, half lament that drifted into the corridors. Yet perhaps the most poignant revelation of this period lay in the stark contrast between Henry's omnipotence and his vulnerability. He who had once severed England's ties to Rome, who had commanded the dissolution of monasteries and the execution of friends, found himself at the mercy of a wound no blade could vanquish, and a conscience no crown could silence. His body, once the image of regal authority, was now a battleground for infection and shame. He had proven that he could kill those he loved, yet each act of violence only deepened the echo of guilt within his soul. Thus closed the tragic chapter of Anne Boleyn's downfall and Henry's descent into physical torment and remorse. A king who bent church and country to his will remained powerless to conquer the rot in his flesh or the memories that haunted his nights. In that twilight of power and pain, Henry VIII embodied the greatest tragedy of all, that absolute sovereignty can never shield a man from the consequences of his own making. After the shattering tragedy of Anne Boleyn's fall, a new light flickered on the horizon of Henry VIII's court. Jane Seymour, 11 years his junior, emerged as a gentle counterpoint to Anne's fiery brilliance. Born to a family esteemed for its discretion, Jane possessed a quiet grace that stood in stark relief to the tempestuous spirit of her predecessor. On the 30th of May, in the year 1536, just 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry urged his council to confirm an engagement to Jane with all possible haste. There was no grand festivity, no trumpets heralded their betrothal, and the ceremony itself was subdued, as though the king feared to linger a moment longer in anticipation of a future heir. In the wake of their union, Jane settled into her role with a serenity that seemed almost providential. Courtiers noted her unassuming manner. She preferred the soft murmur of cloistered gardens to the clamour of banquet halls. When she walked the corridors of Whitehall Palace, the echoes of Henry's earlier revels faded behind her, replaced by a hushed calm. The king, for his part, appeared buoyed by genuine affection, granting Jane the title of Queen Consort with a tenderness unseen since his first marriage. Within months, Jane's condition so long desired was confirmed. She was with child. The news spread through England's counties like the glow of candlelight in a dark chapel. In the autumn of 1537, the palace preparations reached a fever pitch. Cradles were readied, and lords and ladies debated the proper linens and silks to welcome the long-awaited son. Henry, whose own health had declined under the twin burdens of his leg ulcer and the strain of successive losses, seemed suddenly rejuvenated by the prospect of male issue. He knelt before the altar at St. George's Chapel in Windsor on All Hallows Day, the 1st of November, offering prayers of gratitude that bordered on sacred fervour. On the 12th of October in the year 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son in the hushed dawn hours. The event was announced by the pealing of cathedral bells across London and by cannon fire from the Tower of London, each boom a herald of imperial hope. Henry VIII, standing in the doorway of the birthing chamber, was said to be so overcome with joy that he wept openly. He bestowed upon his son the name Edward Tudor, soon to be known as Edward VI, and declared that at last the Tudor promise would be fulfilled. Nobles and foreign ambassadors alike sent congratulatory dispatches, celebrating the birth of the Prince of Wales, whose arrival would secure the Protestant succession Henry had fought so fiercely to establish. Yet even as England rejoiced, a pall of dread settled over the palace. Just 12 days after Edward's birth, on the 25th of December in 1537, Christmas Day itself, Jane Seymour's condition took a dire turn. Complications from the childbirth, now identified by physicians as puerperal fever, overcame her fragile constitution. By the evening mass, she was too weak to leave her chamber. The Queen Consort, who had offered solace to a grieving king, now leaned upon him in her own final struggle. Henry, wearing his finest velvet cloak embroidered with the Tudor rose, spent those last hours at her bedside, holding her hand as candlelight danced upon her pale cheeks. Jane's death, unlike the contrived executions of Catherine and Anne, bore the unmistakable mark of mortal misfortune. At the stroke of midnight, she whispered a blessing upon her newborn son and bade Henry to continue his reign with mercy and wisdom. Then, surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting, she drew her final breath, leaving Henry to confront the cruel randomness of fate. The king's grief was profound. He refused to rise from his knees for hours, his tears staining the opulent tapestries of the royal bedchamber. "My heart is broken," he reportedly murmured, echoing words once spoken in Catherine's anguished exile. In the days that followed, Whitehall Palace was heavy with mourning. Courtiers wore black armbands, and the bells tolled in slow knell. Henry's body, already weakened by the chronic ulcer on his left leg, an affliction that had plagued him for nearly 2 years now, felt the full weight of sorrow. The sore, once treated with poultices of bread and vinegar, festered still, sending pangs of agony through his lower limbs. Yet even as his frame grew gaunt, he found no respite in rest. His mind, shattered by successive bereavements, roamed in restless sleep, haunted by memories of the 2 queens he had loved and lost. And so the cycle began anew. Despite his shattered heart, Henry's obsession with securing a male lineage would not let him tarry. Even in his grief, he contemplated a 3rd marriage, seeking once more to bind political alliance with personal desire. The brief joy of Edward's birth, so long awaited and so swiftly overshadowed by Jane's untimely death, had shown him both the promise and the peril of his quest. Yet he remained resolved. A sovereign might yield to illness, he believed, but he could never cede the right to ensure his dynasty's survival. In this quiet interlude of Christmas morning, Henry VIII found himself at the crossroads of power and fragility. A husband bereft, a father determined, he stood alone amid the echoes of cathedral bells and palace laments. The Tudor saga continued, propelled by an iron will that neither pain nor loss could temper, forging onward toward the next union, the next alliance, and the next tragedy hidden just beyond the horizon of hope. In the year 1540, King Henry VIII entered into a political alliance that he hoped would strengthen England's standing on the continent. On the 6th day of January in that year, he married Anne of Cleves, daughter of the Duke of Cleves, in a ceremony held at the Palace of Whitehall. Anne arrived in London with high hopes and dignified bearing, having been described by her own courtiers as pleasant and comely in appearance. Yet when Henry first set eyes upon her at their meeting on the eve of their wedding day, he was sharply disappointed. In full view of assembled ambassadors and noble spectators, he quipped that she resembled the Flanders mare, and insisted that her breath carried a foul, sinful odour beyond endurance. Despite Anne's genuine kindness and moderate beauty qualities noted in dispatches sent back to Cleves, Henry refused to proceed with a public coronation. He claimed the marriage had been contracted under false pretenses, that the likeness painted for him had been misleading. By the 9th of July in the same year, merely 6 months after their union, a private hearing at Chelsea marked the formal annulment of their marriage. Parliament passed the Act of Annulment that very month, declaring the king's marriage to Anne null and void. Rather than exile her, Henry treated Anne with uncommon generosity for a discarded royal consort. She was granted the style of the king's beloved sister, received lands and income equal to that of a queen dowager, and took residence at Richmond Palace. She lived out her days in England in relative comfort, far from the tragedy that would soon befall Henry's next bride. No sooner had Anne of Cleves been set aside than the king's eye fell upon a young lady of the court, Catherine Howard, niece of his ill-fated second queen, Anne Boleyn. Catherine was but 19 years of age when she caught Henry's attention in July of 1540, and her vivacious youth and ruddy complexion reminded him of days long past. Henry, now 49 years old, was by then grossly overweight, confined to move with difficulty because of the ulcer on his left leg that had first festered in 1536. Nevertheless, the allure of Catherine's bright laughter and graceful carriage rekindled in him a sense of vitality he believed lost forever. Catherine's upbringing, however, had been marked by youthful indiscretions. Before her elevation to court, she had known several gentlemen of her acquaintance more intimately than propriety would permit. When Henry decided to marry her on the 28th of July in the year 1540, he did so with scant inquiry into her past. But by the autumn of 1541, rumours of her former affairs began to swirl through the corridors of Hampton Court. The king's vigilance turned frantic. He ordered his Privy Council to collect every whispered suspicion and compile it into formal accusations of adultery. Among those implicated were Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, and even Catherine's own cousin, Thomas Culpeper's frequent companion in scandal. By the first week of November in 1541, the evidence, largely hearsay and coerced testimony, was deemed sufficient to justify Catherine's arrest. Under cover of night, guards seized her from her apartments in Hampton Court. According to eyewitness accounts, Catherine broke free of her captors, racing down the West Gallery, later named the Haunted Gallery, her skirts billowing as she cried aloud for the mercy of a king who she believed still loved her. She pressed on, panting, only to find herself at a locked door and the guards closing in. Her plea for clemency went unanswered. Catherine was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where she endured a lonely vigil. On the 13th of February in the year 1542, she was led to Tower Hill to face the block. At 19 years of age, with her hair covered by a simple veil, she knelt and offered her final prayers. In her last moments, she beseeched God to have mercy upon her soul, holding fast to a faith that had sustained her through her fall from royal favour. Then, with a single clean stroke, her life was ended, and Catherine joined the tragic roll call of Henry's wives, whose deaths bore witness to the king's inexorable pursuit of power and lineage. In the aftermath of Catherine's execution, the court was engulfed by a hush of shocked sorrow. Henry, already tormented by the chronic pain of his ulcer and by the losses of 4 queens, found himself spiraling further into obsessive melancholy. His body, once the symbol of regal authority, was now a vessel of infection, and his mind grew ever more volatile. He presided over councils with an air of distracted menace, alternately erupting in uncontrollable laughter or roaring with imagined outrage. The king who could bend church and state to his will remained powerless against the rot in his flesh and the gnawing guilt in his soul. Thus did the brief bloom of hope offered by Catherine Howard wilt beneath the shadow of Henry's unrelenting demands. The Tudor tragedy deepened, revealing that even a monarch endowed with absolute power could not escape the consequences of his own merciless ambition. In the silent gloom of Whitehall's private chambers, the echo of Catherine's final plea lingered as a mournful reminder that no crown, however heavy, can shield a man from the ravages of remorse. Catherine Parr entered Henry's life in the heat of midsummer, becoming his 6th wife on the 12th day of July in the year 1543. She was a woman of keen intellect and learning, having published works on scripture and theology in the years preceding her marriage. In private council, Catherine chose each word with care, never daring to contradict the king's most weighty decisions, though in her heart she trembled at the thought of sharing the fate of 5 predecessors. By the autumn of 1543, Henry's once majestic frame had deteriorated alarmingly. The ulcer on his left leg, first ruptured in January of 1536, had grown into a swollen mass, emitting a putrid discharge that clung to his stockings. Guests attending private audiences carried censers of incense, sandalwood, myrrh, frankincense, hoping to conceal the stench that rolled from his chamber like a living thing. Each cough from the king seemed a groaning lament for his lost vigour. No longer could he stride confidently through palace halls. His neck was obscured by rolls of fat, and he was obliged to rely on a network of pulleys to hoist him from bed when daybreak came. Night offered him no respite. Plagued by chronic pain, he found sleep elusive. Each flare of agony sent him thrashing beneath tapestries, his face twisted between grimace and plea. Courtiers stationed outside his door would hear him wail for relief, only to witness him moments later erupt into chilling paroxysms of rage. One virtuous deputy, long loyal to the crown, was said to have been ordered to execution on a whim when Henry mistook a cough for treachery. Catherine, standing at the king's side, could only bow her head in silence, her pale fingers white-knuckled upon the hilt of her prayer book. Despite infirmity and instability, Henry remained driven by the memory of his youth as a warrior king. In the summer of 1544, at 53 years of age, he embarked on what would become his final campaign in France. On the 2nd of July, he landed at Calais with a force of 20,000 soldiers, intent on recapturing Boulogne, which he had first seized 8 years prior. His war chest, long drained by the suppression of monasteries and the expenses of court extravagance, strained to fund this last crusade. Nobles were levied for heavy tenths and 15ths, and merchants groaned under new duties imposed on wool exports. The siege of Boulogne commenced on the 14th of August, in 1544. Cannons thundered day and night, but the king's health hampered his command. He could not mount his horse without assistance, and his constant need for opium-laced poultices dulled his faculties. While Henry weakened, French defenders used the time to reinforce their bulwarks. By the end of September, the English artillery had inflicted damage, but failed to compel a decisive surrender. Back in England, murmurs of discontent rose among the populace. Grain prices soared under the burden of war taxes, and men conscripted into the army perished in droves from dysentery and heatstroke on the march across Flanders. Royal coffers teetered on the brink of collapse, forcing the Privy Council to liquidate former church lands at distress prices. Even the Queen's personal allowance was curtailed, though Catherine's gentle manner concealed the sting of such austerity. When Henry finally withdrew his battered forces in October of 1544, he returned not in triumph, but in exhaustion. The crown's prestige lay in tatters, and France remained defiant. The campaign's cost was calculated at over £50,000, an astronomical sum that threatened to bankrupt the realm. Foreign ambassadors who once whispered of English martial prowess now spoke in hushed tones of a king too infirm to lead and a nation stretched beyond its means. Henry's health continued to decline. His ulcer festered, his weight climbed uncontrollably as he sought comfort in rich foods he could barely digest. Each night, he would gaze at the empty seat beside him at council table, haunted by memories of Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne of Cleves, and Catherine Howard. The tapestry of Tudor glory had unravelled beneath the weight of ambition and bodily decay. Thus did Henry VIII's final years unfold. A sovereign once the very embodiment of martial vigour reduced to a shadow in velvet robes, haunted by pain and remorse. His sixth wife, Catherine, stood as a testament to his capacity for both mercy and fear, as she outlived him, becoming the only queen consort spared execution, and the last in a line of marriages defined by power, tragedy, and an unrelenting quest for legacy. The physical decay of Henry's body unfolded in lockstep with the collapse of his mind. By the autumn of 1545, his ulcer had become a grotesque maw upon his left calf, a swollen wound that wept noxious ichor day and night. Yet it was not only his flesh that rotted. His sanity, once as imperious as his crown, now eroded beneath the twin assaults of pain and remorse. In those months, the king's trust in his own household all but vanished. He became convinced that the Privy Council, the very men who had sworn fealty for decades, plotted his undoing. On whispered suspicion alone, he ordered the arrest and interrogation of Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and Sir Anthony Denny, two courtiers who had faithfully served him since the 1532. They were brought before special commissions, shackled in cold stone vaults below Whitehall, and subjected to ruthless questioning that bordered on torture. Though neither man ever confessed to any conspiracy, the spectacle of their humiliation served to deepen Henry's conviction that enemies lurked behind every tapestry. Night times were the worst. In the dim glow of torches, Henry would sit bolt upright in his four-poster bed, his massive frame convulsing with each spasm of pain. "Is there anyone there?" he would rasp, voice cracking like a dying harp, eyes vacant yet glittering with dread. To the sentinels posted outside his chamber, these words sounded less like a request and more like an accusation directed at unseen phantoms. On more than one occasion, he was observed pressing his lips to the empty air, whispering, "Forgive me, Thomas. Forgive me, Catherine," as though beseeching the very ghosts of his past queens for absolution. Such scenes, recorded by horrified attendants, must have chilled even the hardiest of them to the bone. Catherine Parr's presence offered a slender lifeline to coherence. She remained ever the dutiful queen, never once contesting Henry's edicts, whether concerning ecclesiastical reform or the lavish expenditures that fueled his latest war efforts. Yet beneath her calm exterior lay a heart gripped by terror. In private, she learned to master the art of careful flattery, praising every decision with a measured phrase and steering clear of any subject that might awaken the king's ire. Even so, her intercessions on behalf of imprisoned friends and courtiers were invariably rebuffed, as Henry declared that no man may stand between the throne and truth. As his delusions deepened, Henry ceased to concern himself with matters of state. He abandoned the council chamber for the shadowed solitude of his bedchamber, spending dawn to dusk in prayer and fevered hallucination. He no longer signed proclamations or granted audiences. Instead, he paced the length of his sleeping gallery, later dubbed the Gallows Gallery, by frightened servants muttering apologies to the air. It was said that he once gasped in terror at his own reflection in a polished helmet left upon a table, believing it to be the face of an adversary cloaked in steel. By the winter of 1546, the kingdom's finances teetered on collapse. The treasury, drained by the campaign in France and the dissolution of monastic revenues, could no longer underwrite Henry's obsessions. While Catherine Parr petitioned for mercy to lighten the burden on the common people who now suffered acute shortages of grain and skyrocketing taxes, the king dismissed her pleas, exclaiming, "Let them eat the bread of loyalty, not the crumbs of mercy." His heart, already hardened, seemed to have forgotten how to beat in rhythm with his subjects' needs. In April of 1546, Henry, in one of his final acts of merciless zealotry, ordered the arrest of Anne Askew, an outspoken writer who had dared to challenge royal doctrine. She was condemned for heresy and burned at the stake on the 16th of July, her cries of "Father, forgive them," echoing through the courtyard of Smithfield. Henry watched from a raised dais, his face expressionless, as flames consumed her form, a sight that some courtiers claimed made even his iron resolve waver for a fleeting moment. Yet the agony of his ulcer persisted, and with it the spectre of his former grandeur dissolved further. He could scarcely walk without support, and the chamber doors required mechanical pulleys to open under his weight. His breathing grew laboured, each inhalation a protest against the ravages of infection. In the silence that followed Askew's execution, the only sound was the rasp of Henry's cough, dragging through his chest like a hidden dagger. It was in those final weary months that Henry VIII came to embody the ultimate tragedy of absolute sovereignty. A man who commanded armies, reshaped a nation's faith, and dictated the lives of those around him, yet who remained utterly powerless to halt the decay of his own flesh and the relentless march of a guilt that echoed louder than any royal decree. In the end, neither power nor pride could save him from the darkest chamber of all, the one that lies within. By the dawn of 1547, Henry VIII's strength had ebbed to a flicker. The ulcer on his left leg, first torn open in January of 1536, had long since become a festering wound that no salve could staunch. His once mighty frame, bloated with untold riches and gluttonous feasts, was now gaunt and broken, weighed down by layers of velvet robes that could not conceal the smell of corruption seeping from his flesh. Every breath he drew was a rasp, as though lungs and heart conspired to shorten the span of his suffering. For weeks he lay confined to his bedchamber at Whitehall Palace, attended by physicians who washed away clotted bandages and offered pewter goblets of medicinal broth. These were the same rooms where he had once tossed in fevered delirium rooms that now fell silent, save for the rattling of his breaths and the soft prayers of his chaplain. On the 28th of January in the year 1547, just 2 months after his 55th birthday, Henry exhaled for the final time. Those present later recounted that his eyes fluttered closed as though at rest, yet the air remained thick with the unspoken weight of a lifetime of deeds both grand and dreadful. Court records note that, in the hours before his death, attendants heard the king's voice call out names once beloved. "Catherine," he whispered. "Anne, Catherine, Jane," as though summoning the ghosts of his wives to attend his final judgment. Some claimed the shadows on the wall flickered as if replying, though none dared approach the bedchamber door to confirm the vision. Such stories spread through the court like a chill wind, ensuring that even in death, Henry's reign would be remembered not solely for crowns and conquests, but for the spectral burden of remorse he carried to the end. His passing closed the most powerful reign in English history. Soldiers who had fought under his banner paused in foreign fields, their banners lowered in tribute as word of his death reached them. In London, bells tolled across the city, echoing off stone walls and muddy Thames banks. Merchants ceased their bargaining. Craftsmen laid down their tools. All eyes turned to the boy king, Edward VI, newly crowned at 9 years of age, who inherited a throne leached of riches by war and scandal. Yet even Edward's reign proved fleeting. 15 years later, in the year 1562, the young monarch succumbed to illness, dying at the tender age of 15, his brief life a poignant coda to his father's tumultuous saga. The Tudor succession then turned to Mary and Elizabeth, the daughters Henry had once cast aside in pursuit of sons. Mary, Catherine of Aragon's child, ascended as Mary I and sought to restore the church her father had sundered. Her half-sister, Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, later reclaimed the throne, shepherding England into a golden age. In the end, history delivered a poetic justice. Henry's daughters triumphed, where his sons faltered, vindicating the very women he had wronged. The tapestry of Holyrood and Whitehall, once bright with triumphal arches and jousting fields, faded into shadow. The monasteries dissolved under his orders lay in ruin, replaced by private estates and merchants' warehouses. Townsfolk whispered of ghostly apparitions in the corridors of Hampton Court and Westminster, hearing the lamentations of those who had perished by royal decree. Pain and penance became Henry's legacy as much as the Church of England or the splendour of Tudor pageantry. In the annals of posterity, the life of Henry VIII endures as a cautionary tale, that even the fiercest crown cannot shield a man from the stings of conscience. Power, once seized, can be wielded to reshape kingdoms, but it cannot rewrite the ledger of the soul. His 6 marriages, 5 executions, and countless reforms all attest to a restless pursuit of legacy. a pursuit that ultimately demanded its own reckoning. And so, as candle flames gutter low in the grand hall of history, Henry remains entwined with the phantoms of his choices. The echo of his triumphs and tragedies lingers in every carved oak panel, and in the many chapels where his memory is evoked. For those who listen in the stillness of Whitehall's empty chambers, they might yet hear his final plea. A whisper that outlasts dynasties, reminding each of us that the weight of our actions endures beyond the span of our mortal breath. Upon the death of Henry VIII on the 28th of January, in the year 1547, the crown passed to his only surviving son by Jane Seymour, Edward Tudor, who succeeded as King Edward VI at the tender age of 9. From the outset, Edward's reign was overseen by a series of regents, first Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who vied for supremacy in the young king's name. Though Edward himself was known for a keen intellect and earnest piety, his minority left England prey to factional intrigue. Religious reform, begun under his father's break with Rome, accelerated during Edward's rule. In 1648, the Book of Common Prayer replaced the old Latin liturgy by virtue of the Act of Uniformity, setting the nation firmly on a Protestant course. Yet not all accepted these changes with equanimity. Pockets of conservative resistance remained in the shires, where vestiges of the old Mass persisted in hushed gatherings. The Privy Council oscillated between hardline reformers and more moderate voices, uncertain whether to press more radical measures or to temper zeal with stability. Tragically, Edward's own health proved as fragile as the political equilibrium of his court. Born on the 12th of October in 1537, he suffered from recurring bouts of tuberculosis and measles. On the 6th of July, in the year 1553, King Edward VI breathed his last at the Palace of Greenwich, scarcely 15 years and 9 months old. His death extinguished the male Tudor line and thrust the throne into chaos. Factions sprang up once more, with Northumberland attempting to install Lady Jane Grey as Edward's successor, but her 9-day reign collapsed under popular and noble opposition. In this vacuum of authority, Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon and Henry's first queen, emerged as the rightful heir. A devout Catholic, Mary proclaimed herself queen on the 19th of July in 1553. Her accession marked a dramatic reversal of religious policy. She repealed Edward's Protestant statutes, restored papal supremacy, and reopened the old monasteries. Within months, she had married Philip of Spain on the 25th of July in 1554, forging a powerful, if unpopular, Catholic alliance. Mary's determination to eradicate Protestant heresy earned her the sobriquet Bloody Mary. Between the years 1554 and 1558, over 200 Protestants were burned at the stake under her orders, including notable figures such as Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Yet even in her fervour, Mary did not wholly dismantle her father's ecclesiastical upheaval. The administrative reforms of the Episcopal Church, now firmly ensconced, proved too entrenched to uproot entirely. England's navy, honed under Henry VIII, remained independently managed without papal interference, ensuring that while Mary could restore communion with Rome, she could not reverse every facet of her father's legacy. Mary's reign was further troubled by political conspiracies and popular unrest. In the spring of 1554, Sir Thomas Wyatt led what became known as Wyatt's Rebellion, occasioned by resistance to the Spanish marriage and fear of foreign influence. The uprising, though suppressed, underscored deep-seated divisions. Clergy and laity alike were torn between allegiance to Mary's Catholic vision and the Protestant gains of Edward's brief tenure. Mary's health, too, proved capricious. Despite her determination, she failed to bear offspring with Philip, leaving the question of succession unresolved. On the 17th of November, in the year 1558, Queen Mary I died at St. James's Palace, childless and amid lingering tension between religious factions. Her passing closed the chapter on the ever-changing faith of the Tudor monarchy and the hopes for a Catholic restoration. With Mary's death, the crown passed to her half-sister, Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, who acceded on the 17th of November in 1558. Elizabeth I would inherit a kingdom weary of religious turmoil and wary of absolute power. Yet she would preside over what came to be celebrated as England's Golden Age, restoring a measure of religious compromise and guiding the nation towards stability and prosperity. Thus the Tudor saga moved from the tragedy of Henry VIII's 6 marriages and relentless quest for a male heir, through the troubled reigns of his son and 2 daughters, to the dawn of a new era under Elizabeth. The lessons of those years of ambition unchecked, conscience ignored, and faith enforced by zeal would echo through the corridors of power for generations to come, a somber reminder that crowns may change hands, but the human heart remains fraught with the consequences of its own choices. Elizabeth I, long celebrated as the Virgin Queen, ascended the throne on the 17th day of November in the year 1558, inheriting a realm wearied by the tumult of her father's reign and the brief, troubled rules of her brother and sister. From the earliest days of her sovereignty, she exhibited a shrewd understanding of Henry VIII's lessons, that neither rigid Protestantism nor unyielding Catholicism alone could bind her subjects' loyalty. Instead, Elizabeth embraced a policy of via media, a middle way that preserved the structure of the Church of England established by her father in 1534, while allowing for enough traditional ceremony to placate those still attached to the old faith. In the spring of 1559, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, reasserting Elizabeth as the supreme governor of the Church of England, a title carefully chosen to avoid the masculine overtones of supreme head preferred under Henry VIII. Shortly thereafter, the Act of Uniformity reinstated the Book of Common Prayer first introduced under Edward VI, but permitted certain ecclesiastical ornaments and permitted clergy to interpret aspects of the liturgy with a measure of discretion. Through these statutes, Elizabeth fostered a religious settlement that many viewed as a balm to the wounds inflicted by the swings of earlier doctrines, enabling her to govern with a measure of peace her predecessors had never known. Concurrently, the naval revolution that Henry VIII had set in motion gathered full momentum under her reign. Beginning in 1559, Elizabeth authorized the expansion of the navy from a handful of ships to a formidable fleet whose reputation would soon eclipse that of Spain's armada. The Crown invested heavily in building new galleons, such as the Revenge launched in 1583, and in commissioning skilled privateers like Sir Francis Drake to harry enemy vessels in the Caribbean and along the Spanish Main. By the summer of 1588, England's maritime forces had grown so robust that they would famously repel the Spanish Armada that Philip II dispatched against England that July and August. Elizabeth's treasury, bolstered by revenues originally seized by Henry VIII from monastic lands, proved crucial in funding both naval construction and burgeoning cultural patronage. Vast estates and abbey holdings, long since converted to royal and noble lands, generated rents and agricultural produce that flowed into the royal exchequer. With these resources, Elizabeth became a notable patron of the arts and sciences. Playwrights such as William Shakespeare penned their first works under her auspices, while scholars in the court of Queen's College, Oxford and Cambridge University attended to the astronomical studies of John Dee, whose voyages into the mysteries of navigation aided England's seafarers. At the same time, Elizabeth championed the voyages of exploration that would extend England's influence into the New World. Beginning in 1566, she granted charters to explorers such as Sir Walter Raleigh, whose expedition to Roanoke Island in 1585 marked the first, albeit ill-fated, attempt at English colonization in North America. Following Raleigh's lead, other adventurers set sail to Virginia, Newfoundland and beyond, carrying the Tudor standard across the Atlantic and laying the groundwork for what would become a global empire. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth understood the power of image and propaganda. She cultivated the public persona of a gracious monarch, deftly employing portraits and court pageantry to present herself as the embodiment of national unity. In the iconic Armada portrait painted in 1591, she appears adorned with ermine and lace, her gaze steady, a globe beneath her left hand, suggesting dominion over the seas, a silent rejoinder to the failed Spanish invasion. Such imagery served to soothe lingering resentments over Henry VIII's heavy-handed reforms, redirecting popular memory toward the triumph of Elizabeth's own era. Underneath the surface of stability, however, lay undercurrents of dissent. Catholic powers on the continent never ceased to plot, and English conspirators, inspired by the deposed Mary Queen of Scots, attempted multiple plots against Elizabeth's life. Yet each threat only strengthened her resolve to maintain the delicate balance she had struck between faiths. Her famed speech to the troops at Tilbury in August of 1588 encapsulated this resolve. "I may yet live to be your queen, and I know you will not fail me," she declared, her voice ringing with calm authority. By the close of the 16th century, England stood transformed. a Protestant nation at peace with its own conscience, a naval power without equal on the seas, and a centre of literary and scientific innovation. Elizabeth's skillful stewardship of her father's mixed legacy, tempering the extremes of reform, leveraging the spoils of his ecclesiastical upheaval, and channeling the wealth of dissolved monasteries into cultural and exploratory ventures, ensured that the Tudor name would endure not merely as a byword for merciless ambition, but as a dynasty capable of guiding England into a new age of confidence and glory. Yet, the spectre of Henry VIII continues to haunt English culture centuries after his death. Though he wed 6 times rather than 7, the moniker, the King with Many Wives, has perpetuated the idea that absolute power can corrupt absolutely, and that the sharp edge of an executioner's sword is merely the outward manifestation of a conscience in torment. In the Baroque literature of the 17th and 18th centuries, dramatists seized upon Tudor court intrigues to craft tragedies heavy with supernatural overtones. Playwrights amplified tales of Henry's midnight confessions to phantom queens and his fevered hallucinations, transforming historical record into Gothic spectacle. By the mid-17th century, such works had become staples of the stage. In London's theatres, audiences flocked to see dramatizations of The Haunted King, in which Henry's character, cloaked in royal red and satin, prowls empty chapels, calling out for Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and others long deceased. Lanterns cast long shadows across painted backdrops of Whitehall Palace, and thunderous percussion heralded the arrival of ghostly apparitions. Spectacle abounded. Skeletal figures draped in mourning veils drifted through trapdoors, while Henry, portrayed by actors with ashen faces, convulsed in chains, torn between imperial ambition and remorse. These Baroque tragedies did more than entertain. They offered moral lessons. The audience watched, heart-pounding, as the king's lust for power precipitated the downfall of those who trusted him most. When Henry's spectral victims revealed themselves, each lamenting the injustice of a beheading, they underscored the notion that sin, if not atoned for in life, would demand penance beyond the grave. The line, "By royal decree my wife fell dead, by royal guilt I walk in dread," became a popular refrain, printed in theatrical pamphlets, and later circulated among readers hungry for cautionary tales. William Shakespeare, writing in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, also drew inspiration from Tudor upheavals. While he never penned a play explicitly titled for Henry VIII's court, he incorporated elements of Catherine of Aragon's tragic downfall into King Lear and Hamlet, hinting at broken bonds between ruler and subject, and between parent and child. The motif of a monarch driven to madness by betrayal, seen when Lear rages against his own daughters, echoes Henry's own descent into paranoia after the execution of wives and advisers. In Macbeth, too, the dark swirl of regicide and its supernatural consequences, banquets haunted by invisible guests, sleep disturbed by guilt, recalls the dramatic retelling of Henry's hallucinations in Baroque theatre. As the 18th century progressed, Romantic poets and novelists revisited Tudor themes with renewed fascination. Sir Walter Scott's historical romances often featured brooding references to Henry's ill-fated marriages, contrasting them with the passionate heroism of later protagonists. Gothic novelists such as Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Lewis set scenes amid decaying castle walls, evoking the Tudor era's turbulent legacy. In Radcliffe's works, protagonists sometimes wander through corridors that once echoed with Henry's footsteps, their imaginations conjuring shapes of women in white gowns crying out for vengeance. Lewis's The Monk, published in 1597, uses the yardstick of Henry's excesses, bloodshed, betrayal, enforced silence to criticize the perils of clerical and secular tyranny alike. Even in the realm of visual art, Henry's image endured. 18th century engravers produced broadsheets showing him enthroned, a grim jester beneath his velvet robes, bearing a dagger behind his back. These prints, captioned with verses, warned that kings may stand secure on the dais, yet tremble at their deeds in empty halls. Private collectors prize these illustrations as memento mori, a reminder that no crown can shield one from the judgments of conscience. Scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries have traced a direct line from Tudor narratives to modern horror tropes. The idea of a ruler plagued by ghosts, each apparition representing a past sin surface in films and literature throughout the 20th century. Henry's story, with its blend of political drama and psychological torment, prefigures the classic motif of the haunted sovereign. When stage and screen adaptations depict a sovereign pacing candlelit chambers, anguished and delusional, they tap the same primal fear of retribution that our ancestors projected onto Henry's memory. Throughout all these retellings, the core message remains: unchecked authority, wielded without humility, breeds cruelty that demands reckoning. Henry VIII's executions, his personal tragedies, and his ultimate descent into guilt-fueled madness have become emblematic of the dark side of sovereignty. As successive generations reinterpret his life through Baroque theatre, Shakespearean echoes, Gothic fiction, and modern horror, they reaffirm that even the mightiest ruler must answer to forces beyond mere politics, namely, the inescapable echo of conscience. And so the king with many wives lives on, a cautionary spectre reminding us that legacy is shaped as much by remorse as by triumph. On a spiritual plane, the tale of Henry VIII raises unsettling questions of cosmic justice. Was Catherine of Aragon's whispered curse truly a force beyond the grave, or merely the mind's recoil against a ruler's ruthless accumulation of guilt? Contemporary medical writings from the Renaissance offer one path to explanation. Physicians of the mid-16th century speculated that Henry's festering leg sore, first noted in January of 1536, might have originated not in divine retribution, but in a grievous malady such as tertiary syphilis, then little understood. Syphilis, in its advanced stage, can produce lesions that stubbornly refuse to heal, exuding corrosive discharge and searing pain. Equally plausible, they suggested, was chronic gangrene, a slow necrosis of limb tissue that, left unchecked, leads to systemic toxicity and delirium. In the diaries of court surgeons, whose names rarely survive the ledger's ink, one finds references to treatments of balsam, mercury ointments, and poultices of bread and vinegar, remedies more likely to irritate than cure. The endless dressing and redressing of Henry's ulcer, combined with his leanings towards sweet wines and rich foods, may have contributed to a breakdown of his overall constitution. Physicians recorded that he suffered bouts of febrile delirium, during which he would cry out in the night, "Is there no mercy in heaven for the man who has shown none on earth?" Such episodes, they feared, presaged not just a wasting body, but a shattering of the mind. Modern historians and medical researchers have revisited these accounts with 21st century knowledge. Many now believe that Henry VIII's decline resulted from a combination of rheumatoid arthritis, exacerbated by type 2 diabetes, and the chronic infection in his left leg. Diabetes impairs circulation and delays healing, which, in concert with recurrent infections, can lead to systemic inflammation. Such physiological stress is known to precipitate mood swings, cognitive impairment, and hallucinations, symptoms long attributed to supernatural causes by terrified onlookers. In this light, Henry's whispered conversations with unseen figures, his tearful pleas for forgiveness from wives long entombed, might well reflect the mind's fracturing under relentless physical torment. Yet even armed with medical explanations, one cannot wholly dismiss the power of folklore. Hampton Court Palace, where Henry spent many of his final years, remains a crucible of ghost stories. Visitors to the fabled haunted gallery report hearing faint sobbing and the echo of hurried footsteps after dusk. Some swear they have glimpsed a fleeting figure in Tudor attire, hair arranged in the style of Catherine Howard, dart across the length of the corridor, pausing only to cast a glance of anguish before vanishing into shadow. These legends, first recorded in guidebooks of the 18th century, persist in modern tour narratives, ensuring that the spectre of Catherine's alleged curse endures in the public imagination. Local tradition holds that on cold, mist-laden nights, the moonlight through the tall, mullioned windows of Hampton Court casts long, skeletal shadows upon the ancient stone floor. It is in these liminal moments that the boundary between history and haunting seems to dissolve. One can almost hear the ripple of silk skirts and the soft huff of breath, not a living breath, but the residue of a woman wronged, crying out for justice that time itself has failed to grant. Tour guides often lower their voices, speaking of how even guards and palace staff avoid the corridor after the moon rises, recounting tales of sudden chills and the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. For all the empirical insight of modern scholarship, the power of these ghostly narratives lies in their root in human empathy. People have long sought patterns, causality, and meaning in the wake of unredeemed cruelty. Catherine's last word, cursed, lingers beyond the chronicler's pages, because it encapsulates the universal dread that our actions, once set in motion, may return to pursue us. Whether one favors a medical diagnosis or embraces the notion of supernatural recompense, the story of Henry VIII's final days remains a potent emblem of a monarch bound by the very sins he believed he could command into silence. And so, even as science offers explanations for fevered hallucinations and festering sores, the legend of the Tudors' haunted halls persists. It reminds us that some legacies elude rational cure, echoes of justice unmet, remorse unatoned, and the deep, unquiet yearning of a people for their history to render, in equal measure, both triumph and warning. In the hush of midnight at Hampton Court, one may still choose to believe that Catherine's spirit walks those corridors, an eternal testament that lords and commoners alike cannot escape the resonance of conscience, nor the shadows cast by deeds done long ago. And so we come to the close of our journey through a life both dazzling and dark, a tale woven from ambition, love, remorse, and the echoes of choices that linger long after crowns have fallen. Take a slow, deep breath now, and feel the weight of history gently lift from your shoulders as the last candle's flame flickers, its light softening against the time-worn stones of Whitehall. Imagine the hush settling over those grand, silent chambers once filled with clangs of armour and hurried footsteps, now offering only the quiet rustle of gowns and the distant call of a lone nightingale outside. Allow your mind to drift on the muted currents of reflection, recalling that beneath the gilded pageantry lay a man burdened by his own desire for power and the unspoken cost it exacted upon those he cherished. Know that the greatest lesson from this story is not the sharp edge of an executioner's sword, but the subtle ache of conscience, a reminder that even the mightiest among us can be undone by a single moment of cruelty, and that true strength often lies in humility, in mercy, in the quiet act of compassion rather than the roar of authority. Let your heart beat slow in harmony with the rhythm of bygone centuries, and sense how the threads of empathy connect us all across time, across titles, across the very gulf between life and legend. Perhaps you feel a gentle stirring in your chest, a soft pulse of understanding that our own small choices, made each day, speak far louder than any royal decree. In this twilight hush, imagine the ghosts of the past finding peace at last, their whispered stories settling like petals upon a still pond, leaving only ripples of wisdom behind. Now, as your eyelids grow heavy, picture those final curtains drawing closed on the great Tudor stage, the audience rising as one to honour both the triumphs and the tragedies they have witnessed. Feel the tender glow of gratitude for the gift of history, for the chance to learn from lives that shimmered with brilliance, and yet, like all of ours, were touched by sorrow. Let that warmth spread through you as you sink deeper into comfort, the echoes of our tale fading into the soft embrace of night. And so, dear listener, carry with you this gentle truth, that every story, no matter how grand or harrowing, can guide us toward kindness, toward a deeper sense of shared humanity. May your dreams be as serene as the still waters beneath a moonlit sky, and may the lessons of yesterday light the path to a kinder tomorrow. Good night, and if you've enjoyed this journey, subscribe to our channel to explore more stories that soothe the soul and stir the imagination. Sleep well, and until next time, sweet dreams. Whispered.